your specific focus and interests cover a wide range.
Yeah, well, listen, Mr. Lockwood. So I get to, hold on, this is me interviewing the interviewer. So I get to set up the rules today. So, Mr. Craig Lockwood, welcome to the Passion Project.
Finally.
Give me a little high five here. I'm super, super happy to have you in-house today in the chair. And it's so funny because part of what we'll talk about is, this is a big part of your profession. You've interviewed people and journaled, photographed and tracked, and you're a historian amongst many other things. So I totally get to flip the switch on you. I'm in charge. You get to answer the questions. I get to ask them. Totally outside your comfort zone. Craig Lockwood, welcome. I'm super honored and humbled and super happy to have you here. What's fun, and again, the first bit, we're just going to set the table here. I met you probably 30 years ago, and doing the math, I would have been about the age, you would have been about the age I am today. When we met. And I don't remember exactly how we met. It was right around the beginning of my prone paddling Catalina Classic time, which we'll talk a lot about the ocean and paddling.
Traditional
paddling, yes. But let me set the stage of Craig Lockwood for those that don't know you. So a very diverse background of longtime lifeguard, growing up, and I don't even know all of it, and this is what we're going to dig into. A lot of time in Laguna Beach, a historian, a paddler, a waterman. You have a peer group that is the group that I always look up to, of the icons of the history of surfing and paddling. And you're an author, on and on and on. And your story, and again, I only know bits and pieces, and that's why I'm stoked, because I've known you for a long time, but I only know part of it. And so we're going to dig into that today as you giggle every time I talk, which is awesome. Can we jump in?
Let's go.
Let's go. Craig, so I was saying we met while it would have been in the mid-90s, right after I did, or right around the time of my first Catalina Classic. I don't remember how I met you, other than I might have just been the big mouth kid that goes, "Hey, you're that guy." I don't know. I don't know if you remember. There's a camaraderie amongst paddlers. That might be just the impetus for it.
We met through a friend of yours.
Who?
And I'm trying to remember the friend.
Scott Lincoln, maybe? Or
I believe it was.
Or
it was.
TJ Brymer from the Frog House, or one of those
either
guys?
One.
Kip Kennedy, perhaps? Rest his soul?
Kip, rest his soul.
That might have been Kip, actually. So we're talking about some local Orange County prone paddlers, surfers that date back a ways. And back then, the prone paddling population was really, really small here. You would have been one of very, very few back in the day doing it. Today, it's much more robust, and it's really fun to see it grow. But back then, if somebody was a prone paddler around here, you kind of made friends.
Well, I take exception to the prone paddling description, because a lot of those prone paddlers are on their knees. And it just limits it to one position.
Interesting. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. So we could very easily jump ahead. We are going to get into the prone discussions and the surf. The reality is, I want to set the stage here that this is not a paddling podcast. It's not a lifeguarding podcast. It's a storytelling podcast and a history podcast, and connecting the dots and shining a light on people that have a really amazing story, that do really, really cool things. And that, Craig, is you. And sitting in front of us is a bunch of stuff we're going to talk about, because this is just one of the many layers of Craig Lockwood that are super impressive and is right up my alley. And I think many, many other people will feel the same way when they learn more. But I love history, and I love history of surf, and that, my friend, is something that you are deeply attuned to. But I'd like to start, if we can, with you. Tell me where you grew up.
Well, I'm a Southern Californian, multi-generation. I was born in Pasadena. They didn't have a hospital in Laguna Beach.
No.
And my mother had family in that part of the state.
You kind of dated yourself. Mm-hmm. When did they build a hospital in Laguna Beach? Any idea?
Not until the 1960s.
Gotcha. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, the interesting thing about California in those days, and you'll hear me use that term, those days, quotes, unquotes, was that it was so provincial, and much, much more so than it is in any way now.
How was that evidenced?
Well, high school football teams would literally draw blood to play each other. People were very attuned to their social position depending on their community. So,
what decades are you talking about? What eras?
This is all anywhere from the turn of the century until the 1960s.
And to quantify, you were not born at the turn of the century.
You know, sometimes I reflect on the antiquity of the frame here.
Got it. Do you mind saying what year you were born, or roughly?
I was born in 1938.
What does that make you today?
86.
86?
Yeah.
Dude, you're a stud. You look awesome. So you were born in Pasadena, and then did you guys live there a long time? Did you?
Oh, my family had been owned real estate in a couple of places in Laguna Beach since the early 1920s.
Oh, wow.
And my mother had her design studio in Laguna Beach and a manufacturing facility in Hollywood.
So your mother was an artist?
She was a sculptor and a painter. Yeah.
Pretty acclaimed?
In her time, well known for her work. I would say she had a worldwide reputation as a sculptor, basically of dogs.
Really?
Yeah, she specialized in animals, and she was known for her dogs.
Very interesting. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna press pause because the dog theme is a fun one with you. As long as I've known you, you've had a specific breed of dog. What breed? Well, hold on. Don't answer that. What have been the names of some of these dogs? And I think it'll give the breed away. What are some of the names of your dogs that I've met over the years or that you've had over the years?
Frankfurter.
Okay. I think we might be figuring it out.
Oscar Mayer.
Yes.
Lulu.
Okay. All dachshunds.
All standard dogs.
Standard.
Yeah,
What's
the
the difference?
Big ones.
The big ones.
Big ones, yeah.
I've told that story a lot of times because people go, no, you don't have a friend who's named their dog Frankfurter and Oscar Mayer. I'm like, no, I do. I absolutely do. Okay, so mom was a sculptor primarily of dogs. How did her family end up with, what was the genesis of them having real estate in Laguna back in the early 1900s?
One of her cousins was a real estate developer in Pasadena, and he was quite a gambler and played with the important property owners in this area at the time, one of those being James Irvine.
Oh, wow.
And he won a little hunk of land on the beach in Laguna.
Hold on. Your great-grandfather?
He was I would have called him an uncle, but I think he was a cousin somewhat removed.
Okay, but your relative, through a gambling event with one of the original Irvine family landowners, scored a piece of land through a gambling gig.
Yeah, my middle name's Callender. His name was Callender.
But that story alone is awesome. I mean, that's amazing.
And that
doesn't happen anymore, does it?
Not to me.
Not to me, right?
But luckily, the property was valuable, and it was called Green Bay, I believe, and it was renamed by my ancestor there as Emerald Bay.
Come on. Really? How much of that property that makes up Emerald Bay, one of the most elite communities in the world, how much of that was your heritage's land, the whole thing?
Nothing. I came along too late.
Oh.
No card games.
Okay, so it had sold off. They had sold it at some point.
Oh,
after
my
that time?
mother had property there, and that's another story, not
Okay.
not
Fair.
for telling.
Okay, got it. All right, but that's the history. But in the early, again, Orange County history, a lot of people may not care, but it's super interesting. Newport Beach, Laguna Beach were very, very small, and they were remote. Getting to Laguna from Pasadena in the early 1900s was probably a full-day event or multi-day event.
You could take a train to Newport, and if you had a car handy or could rent a taxi, get to Laguna Beach. There, after 1926, I think it was, the ranch land along the coast was, a highway was dedicated, Highway 1. Went all the way to San Clemente.
Yeah, Coast Highway. Got it. Super neat. And so did you guys bounce back and forth between Pasadena and Laguna?
We did. My mother had her design studios there. We had a place on the beach. We spent all our time there, and I went to school in Pasadena for some of my grade school, and then went away to school after that.
Oh, you did?
Mm-hmm.
Where'd you go away to school?
I went to a small school called Palomar Preparatory here.
Where is it?
In Riverside County, or it was, no
Gotcha.
longer.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. And would you then still spend your summers in Laguna? Is that?
Oh, yeah, we spent all our spare time there. My mom kept a car in Newport during the war, and because gas was rationed. So being able to drive back and forth was prohibitively difficult. She had two cars, and one older car she parked down in Newport, and we would take the train Friday afternoon after I got out of school, take the train down to Newport, jump in the Model A, it was a Model A
Wow.
Ford, and chug down to Laguna Beach, 9 miles down to Laguna Beach. That didn't take a lot of gas, so back and forth was about a gallon of gas.
And again, this would have been in the 40s.
During World War II.
During World War II. What was it like here during World War II? Do you recall?
Yeah, it was very
quiet?
provincial and small and very, very isolated. We had the Marine bases to the south, Pendleton, El Toro to the east, and so the active service community was present in Laguna Beach and Newport both, and so that was fascinating for a kid. And
Good times?
well, there was always something happening.
I can only imagine. We're going to talk about your experience in Laguna. As you get a little bit older, we'll frame that in there, because that's got to be, again, talking about Laguna during those times, I think a lot of what you write about is back from around that generation, right?
The period I'm most fascinated with is, I call it between the wars. The end of World War I, 1919, the beginning of World War II in 1941, and the end of World War II in 1945. And so my primary focus, as I don't call myself a surf historian, I'm a journalist, and my journalistic interest and thrust is toward that period and the characters who formed it and the continuation of their efforts as they matured from being quite young in most cases to older and developed what we now define as surf culture.
Yeah, I love that. I often wonder if that was, for some reasons, certainly not for all, but the allure of surfing at that time between empty beaches, clean water, prolific fish and marine life, and it seems very beautiful. No wetsuits. There's pros and cons for sure, but I love what you do, and I promise we're going to get to that. But I want to keep going. So you go to boarding school. Mm-hmm. Does that prep you for a college?
It did, yeah.
And where did that take you? Where did you go?
I went to UCLA.
You did. Mm-hmm. Okay, you're in Newport Beach, Costa Mesa right now. USC people might not like you, right? And you're wearing the color. I didn't pick up on that. You're wearing UCLA color right now too.
I took
nothing against USC.
Summer courses at SC.
Okay.
I don't know if that counts.
You can have your
I never told anybody that I was a defector.
I'm just messing. What did you focus on at UCLA?
I was initially a PE major.
Physical education?
Mm-hmm. I was going to be a teacher, and I continued that, but I had a dual major of journalism and that was
journalism and PE. Mm-hmm. Listen, I think I skipped over another person in your life. I think your father, was he? Because I think he had
my real dad was a journalist and an author.
Okay, that's what I thought.
And he was killed 7 days after Pearl Harbor, and early,
in service.
Mm-hmm. And my stepdad was an artist, a painter. And he was from the East Coast, and so.
Got it. Okay. So, but your biological father was a journalist.
Yes.
Do you think that is it in your genes?
It goes back farther. I'm a descendant of a Revolutionary War character, James Callender, who was quite a firebrand. He was he was a protege of Benjamin Franklin and that period of American history. He was a Scotchman who immigrated to the United States and stepped off the ship in Boston and was hired by Franklin to work on his newspaper. Callender, that ancestor of mine, had been kicked out of Scotland by King Richard. I think it was James. I forget the
royalty
lineage,
that kicked him out.
They kicked him out. He was seditious and wrote bad things about the royalty, and earned himself free passage
out of the country.
out of the country.
But so two things. One, Callender, that's your middle name, as you said. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So is that a prolific name, or is it just an important family legacy to keep that name going?
Is it a prolific name?
Well, is there a lot of? I don't know.
Are there a ton of other calendars?
I don't know.
They aren't lying around.
Gotcha.
Yeah, to look for them under rocks.
Okay. Just didn't know if it was like a Rockefeller that I just wasn't aware of or something like that.
Well, I think the characteristics of that ancestor were that he was tenacious and a brilliant journalist. He was later on tried and jailed in Virginia by a Supreme Court justice for
unsavory behavior?
Well, he challenged Thomas Jefferson, who he'd been Jefferson's writer and political writer for during the Revolution and that period.
This is a Callender.
This was a Callender.
Okay, so
James
I wasn't wrong.
Thompson.
His
His son was my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather.
Well, whether they were prolific or not, I think they have a role in history of some sort. But going back to my question about lineage and journalism, it sounds like it is. So it is something in your genes, for lack of a better term, right? It seems like
I was fascinated with it as a child, and went into it as a student and as a worker and an adult.
So when you were in college and you had your direction of both PE and journalism, did you have a dream or a goal? Like you're like, I want to be X as a career, or?
I had a lucky moment. I was hired by Bud Desenberg at the Laguna Beach Post and Betsy Rose, his editor, to, do a little reporting while I was in school and to write a weekly column. And it was a really neat break. I mean, wow.
What was the column?
It was called From Where I Sit.
And what was the focus?
Beach.
Oh.
It was the beach column for the paper.
Okay.
The Laguna Beach Post.
The Laguna Beach.
That was sold after I'd done that for about 5 years, and then sold to another company, Vern Spitaleri, the owner of the new paper, took me on, and I graduated to doing a whole page. And then I worked for Times Mirror for the Daily Pilot.
So you came out of UCLA with a journalism degree and went back to Laguna. I'm just connecting the dots. And in Laguna, you get this lucky break to get a job for the Post. And you work for them and then the following owners for multiple. How long did you end up? It was the same paper with a different name, different ownership. Was that how long? 15 years? 10 years?
On and off, probably about 10.
Okay. You mentioned a name. This is just like local knowledge. You mentioned Spitaleri. Is that the same Spitaleri as Mark and Eric Spitaleri and Victory Wetsuits? And
yeah.
We still do business with them. There can't be many, and I know that they're a North Laguna family. Interesting. At the same time, or at some point, there's two directions that we're going to touch on. One is going to be lifeguarding. The other is, you used to tell me stories, and I only know a little bit about it, but were you a war correspondent? Can you tell us about that?
Let's take a jump back in time.
Oh yeah, I love this part.
To the cover of this book.
Okay. Let's hold that up. This is the Peanuts Larson book. Where we're going to do, where? There we go. Okay. This is a book that you wrote. What year did you write this book?
2009, I think.
Okay. Give the quick.
No, wait. I have to
should we
look at
dig
that.
through it?
I'll
look while you tell the story.
I did a major article for Surfer's Journal. That may have which precluded this.
Got it.
You'll find the.
Is that it right there?
No.
I don't know. Here. We're gonna let's not worry too much about the date at this point.
No, anyhow.
But Peanuts.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about why it was, just the way
it was.
The way never going to be again. Okay.
Yeah. Here's.
Craig, I'm not going to worry about. Let's not worry about the date.
You can edit.
I'll find it later. So, you wrote this, but again, we're talking about the war correspondent aspect of your life.
Well, it starts here.
Okay.
And that's Hobie. That's Tom Morey. This is Laguna Beach, 1953. And
those two names are two of the most.
This is a photograph taken by supposedly the LA Times, but actually Peanuts Larson grabbed his camera, and was a beautiful speed graphic that press photographers used in those days. He fascinated Larson, and he fumbled around with it and talking to the guy about how neat it was, and took that picture. And the picture was so wonderfully composed that they used it the next day in the LA Times.
But the two names you said, who are the two that you mentioned that are in this?
Hobie
Alter, and the other?
Tom Morey.
And Tom Morey.
Right.
Two of the fundamental innovators of the sport of surfing. Awesome. And so how does that tie into your work correspondent aspect of your life?
These were people who were so active in what they did and how they did it. I spent hours every day in Hobie's garage during the summer while he was shaping, because our houses were, I was 5 houses away from Hobie to the north on the little street that runs parallel to the beach, Gaviota. And Tom Morey lived 2 blocks away from where I lived, my family lived. And
these guys were a little older than you, though, right?
Yeah. Morey was, Hobie was already going to Chaffey College in Ontario, and he was probably 19, 20.
So you were, and you would have been, if he was 19, you would have been how old?
I was 14.
Okay, so you're about
15.
5 years younger. So, I mean, this is the part that, like, I love this type of history. So I'm going to pivot. You're going to come back to this war correspondent thing whenever you're ready. But let's talk about, because this is a big part of your life that I love. You've always told me you're like one generation below the innovators, the icons, and you just named a bunch of them: Hobie Alter, Tom Morey. And I just listened to a podcast by Dick Metz, who is one of my favorite. He's sharp as a tack, and he would have been there with you.
He was right. He was one of those guys, as we called them, those guys. You know. And they were, all of them had a lot of innovative energy, and they manifested. They produced. They created an industry from kind of a small little unknown sport, surfing.
So Hobie was one of the, both of those guys were absolute engineering minds without formal training. And they went on to create, Tom Morey was the Morey Boogie and the foam that everybody that rides a boogie board.
Tom had plenty of engineering.
Okay, he did.
He was classically an engineer, yes.
And I heard the same thing about Hobie, which a lot of that was.
I think Hobie had I don't know what Hobie's academic background was, but he certainly thought that way. And he had the guidance of, a family that took really good interest in his business and made it a business out of a hobby, really.
So, and for anybody that's listening or watching that doesn't surf or know much about surfing, maybe it's not that interesting. This is the 2 people we're talking about here, as Craig just said, created. If you've heard of surfing, it starts with these guys. Not that they were the first surfers, but they were the ones that started innovating and mass production. The first surf shops were opened by Hobie and Dick Metz in Hawaii and in Southern California.
Exactly.
They made the first factory for surfboards, and Tom Morey made the first boogie boards that everybody in the world has used if you've gone to the beach. It started with these 2 gentlemen that you grew up with in the garage. How freaking cool is that? I love that. That's amazing.
As I said, I was fortunate to be the little kid standing there holding Hobie's plane in that photograph.
That's you in the photo. Dude, that is so awesome.
So it was a nice lineage to be attached to, and I was lucky because they were wonderful guys. I constantly bothered them as a child because I was curious. And so I got the nickname Genius for all of the questions I asked, and I kept notes. And one day, Hobie, I had left my little notebook for school. We had to do that at that school. Had to make notes on a daily basis during the summer. And I had left my notebook on Hobie's tool table in his garage where he did all his shaping at that point before he had a shop. And he's reading my notebook and says, "How'd you learn these big words?"
Osmosis, right? In the room. And what did they treat you like? Were you a little brother or a little pest or were they?
I went anytime anybody left for Salt Creek or San Onofre, I was in the car.
Okay.
Because I had an allowance that I had saved. And I had 2 mason jars full of quarters and 50-cent pieces
So you would
to get in the gates.
So they would. So let's step back then on the beach. Again, we will get back to the war correspondent one. Was a super, like, that's always been on my list to ask you about. But let's stay on the surf. When did surfing become part of your life? Obviously, early on, you're spending time with these innovators that are surfing in Laguna. But when did you find the ocean?
I got my first surfboard when I was about 12. It was a hand-me-down paddleboard that was had been made for a child. It was thinner and lighter.
Made out of?
Plywood. And, we called them kook boxes.
I have one on the wall.
Yes. And
there's one right there. On that.
That's right. And so in that picture, the board Hobie had shaped for me, I think it's the white one behind me. Here. Let me evaluate this. Yeah, this was my little...
Oh, that's your board.
7-foot
And again,
twin finned.
Really? Like a Simmons type thing? Again,
it was a Simmons type.
I'm dorking
right.
out right now on stuff.
Simmons would come by Hobie's shop, and
everybody's borrowing ideas. Is that the way it worked? Right. So what year was this photo on the cover of the Peanuts
I think
book?
that's 53.
Wow, that's so cool. Okay, so how did you find the ocean initially? You're spending time in Laguna every summer. Was it just natural? Were you just always on the beach?
Wake up in the morning. I slept in my trunks. I had 2 pairs. I had to wash one out so they didn't get crusty and give you a rash. And I would sleep in my trunks and wash out the old ones and hang them outside.
Just the daily rotation?
Mm-hmm. One summer, I think it was this summer, my folks left for Europe to vacation. And I was consigned to a family friend who was a lifeguard at Oak Street. And I stayed at his house. I had a cot in the backyard under an awning shelter that he made for me. And I had a little outboard engine and a skiff, my own skiff, and a small outboard engine. And I would often fish with that and bring stuff back for his family. And that.
What was the ocean like back then as far as fish?
Oh.
This is 50s.
Very, very easy to fish and catch fish. And there's a wide variety of edible and palatable.
And clean and safe, right?
Yeah. The ocean was still our friend.
Yeah, for sure. So did you start surfing around that time? You're fishing. Are you just, were you a young waterman at that point, kind of doing everything?
I just wanted to copy everything these guys did. They were, as I said, hugely active, and that was everything everybody did.
And when you say everything, back then, and correct me, they did everything. They sailed, they fished, they dived, they dove. Thank you for correcting me. They did everything, and they went on to be big boat builders as well, and really, again, innovative. But they were watermen. They were beach people. They spent their time in and around the ocean all the time.
Water defines it. That was it. It was an application of any skills you could attach to keep you in and active around the ocean. And they were marvelous innovators. Many of these guys were World War II vets, so they had experienced warfare and in different capacity. The lifeguard here, Hobie Alter, in this picture, was a school teacher at Laguna High. And he had been in the Air Force, a bomber crewman. Tom Morey had just gotten out of the service at that point. Hobie didn't go in, I think, because he had surf knots.
That's like back to Big Wednesday. It's a way to stay out of the military.
That's where that
deformations
came from.
on their knees. Right?
Yeah, that came from that. And so they brought a lot of energy to, trips to San Onofre and down to Mexico to do pioneer kind of barrier breaking surf trips. And
everything was kind of new in that realm at that time, right?
Yeah, it was all brand new. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
You just brought up the war. So can we go back to the war correspondent piece?
Yeah.
You said this was kind of the impetus or the genesis to it. How? And then tell me all about it. I don't know how you got into it. What was that an enroll? Fill us in.
My biological father had been a war correspondent.
And he passed during the war as a war correspondent?
Well, prior to the war, between World War I, at the end of World War I, he'd been in the service and had gotten out and then covered, because he had an initial background as a journalist in Canada, of all places, and went back to France and covered the foundation of the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, and was an AP correspondent, Associated Press correspondent in Lisbon for many years. Lived and covered a lot of that part of Europe. Covered Mussolini's
ascension,
rising in Italy and in Africa. Went to Africa and covered a couple of fracases there.
But he passed when you were very young, so it's not like he instructed you or pushed you. But did it inspire you?
Well, it's interesting when you're raised by a ghost, because my mother didn't remarry at that time for years, and so I didn't have a lot of in the house male figures. So everything that I saw lying around that had been in my dad's study, his library, implements and things that he'd collected, everything had value to me, and I put on a hat and bang out a typewriter. And
so you had osmosis from the guys in Hobie's garage, and you had osmosis from the ghost that raised you in your home to some degree?
Yeah, they all took good care of me.
Hallelujah. Got it. So what happened? How did you end up doing that yourself?
Oh, well, I worked for newspapers, and when fracases came along.
So what fracases were you a part of, or did you journalize?
I have to give you my CV.
I don't. What's your CV? I'm sorry. I don't even know.
Oh, my curriculum vitae.
Oh, okay.
It's just having a little military experience.
But were you in the military?
Briefly.
Briefly. What branch?
Marine Corps.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it was in the Marine Corps that you were doing this? Or no?
No.
Okay.
No. I was in and out, and became, because I'd had that background, somebody thought, well.
So you had some military background,
he knew
and you were a
captain
journalist.
from a corporal, and knew what the ranks were and how all of that worked, and that put me in, in good shape amongst a bunch of hippies who didn't know anything.
So they insert you in.
I just ended up going here and going there.
But you're not going to tell me where.
Well,
that's okay. I don't know if you're allowed to. I'm not sure how that works.
Oh no, all of Southeast Asia, and of course, when Soviet Russia at that time had plans in Afghanistan. They needed a way to get to markets with their oil, and they had pretty much influenced the outcome of everything that was politically
But you were
occur in that area.
And you were there to journalize that or to capture it.
Yeah, I just tagged around and did stories.
Gotcha. What was when you were done with overseas and you come back to, I assume, to Laguna Beach, what kind of influence, again, you mentioned that these other surf guys that we've talked about were all in the military. When you come out of that experience in the Marines and then as a war correspondent, what impact did that have on the rest of your life? Influence, impact, if anything?
Well, I kept coming and going when I had the opportunities.
Oh, you would go back in, they would call you up?
I'd freelanced.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you weren't, I see. So you were a freelance? Both.
I worked for newspapers initially, and went as an accredited correspondent, and then I served as an unaccredited correspondent, or I scratched together credentials enough to get into an area. Carried a bunch of press cards and.
Well, if you weren't forced to go there and you enjoyed this. You enjoyed the opportunity to go do this overseas and in, challenging areas, I would imagine. Otherwise, I think you probably wouldn't have continued. Did you enjoy it?
I did. So I'm struggling to give you the answer you're looking for.
I'm not looking for any answer, Craig. Whatever.
So
I'm just
we
curious.
Can go back, but I think there was a high.
Were you
in all of that?
Were you in harm's way in most of those or some of those?
In and out. I mean, you're unarmed.
Yeah.
So you're always going to be at the
not the whim, but you're being protected by the people around you.
Yeah.
And did that
honestly?
So you were in and out of these. You would do those on and off for decades, for a year. How long would you be a war correspondent?
I went up until the Gulf War.
Is that right? So that would have been.
Yeah. Well, I went through a long period after I'd been married and had a child, and so I didn't do anything then. I was all local. But when at a later stage, when the initial problems in the Middle East really solidified, it was an opportunity, and I took it. And,
got it. Interesting. So this goes back to this kind of diverse, super interesting and wide swath of interests and things that you've done. Because not only were you a war correspondent and a writer, but you go on. Let's talk about.
I filed for the local papers. I filed for the Pilot, which I worked for. I think I worked for them for years, on and off, and for the Register, for the LA Times, and so I had the opportunity to, travel and pay for my my excursions.
Yeah. So
and discretion.
My suspicion is that leads you right into this pile of super cool things that you have produced in front of us. So let's talk about Craig Lockwood as an author, when that started and what the driving force was behind that. You've mentioned a little bit about your interest in history of surf, but can you tell us about this?
Well, my biological father had been an author and a journalist, and I found him, a fascinating character who I had to patch together out of my mother's stories and his friends over the years who would, show up. And I would always hear about things that he'd done, read things that he'd written. And it sort of just, I'd had this ancestor that had been a journalist, James Callender.
It sounds like there's a common thread in some of your words here, in that it's characters. Do you have an affinity or a super interest in, you talk about your father as a character, you talk about these guys as characters, interesting characters. Yeah. Is that what most of these or some of these revolve around?
I think like most writers who write some fiction and a lot of, journalism, you borrow from what you see and who you're able to really spend time with and get to know. They become characters in a sense. Peanuts Larson was an enormous character in my life because he was like Hobie. He was nearby, lived, a few houses away, and spent time in
your circle.
And his stories were so fascinating to me as a kid. He and two or three of the other lifeguards were just marvelous raconteurs. They could tell you hair-raising things that had happened to them or fascinating efforts that they'd undertaken. And, most kids would sit around and listen.
So these guys all seem, not only were they including you, but they're storytellers of their exploits or just talking about what they're doing. Was a lot of it around lifeguarding, around surfing, about living? What was it?
All of those.
Was
Whatever.
it the Wild West?
Hobie Alter was an English teacher at the high school. Danny Shull, who's not in this picture. Charlie Plummer, the lifeguard captain at that time, enormously interesting character. Lived a life out of a novel, and they were never short on sharing. So an abalone supper and a couple of beers, and wow, you got of this incredible
stuff. Was it a little bit of the, not Wild West, but it was, again, these were like formative years for you, but it was also formative years for the beach culture post World War II. Like, this is kind of when it all was starting. And for those of us that grew up a lot later surfing, like, these are the stories we all listened to and the characters that we all grew up hearing about. That's why I know about them. I wasn't around, but I love the stories that I've read about all of these people.
Each one of the people we've just been discussing was a compelling, interesting figure. They had all of them were quite articulate and capable of expressing themselves very well when they wanted to, not overtly. They didn't blabber, but when they told a story, it was worth listening to and made an impression on the kid who wanted to be a writer.
Got it.
So here was my material. The first article I ever published in a magazine.
So we're talking about these prolific characters that could express themselves very well if they wanted to.
When when they needed to get a point across, there was no
problem.
No problem.
Got it.
Hobie could express himself in terms of his creations, you know.
Let me ask
Tom
you this.
Morey
Yeah.
was marvelous. He was really, later on, I've got a great Tom Morey story for you at another point.
Got it. My assumption is anybody that's as capable and innovative and arguably brilliant like those guys to come up with what they did, they're going to be smart across, they're going to have capacity across everything, you know, whether it's telling good stories or they're capable and everything. They weren't just smart at engineering and building surfboards. Like, they were very intelligent human beings.
They were
right?
rounded.
Rounded. That's
Yeah.
a great way to put it.
Maybe not in the classic academic sense of that word, but they drew from enough personal experience and lifetime experiences to be able to meld together answers for your questions if you were a, you know, curious kid,
Yeah.
that were satisfying and created a level of comfort in knowing that what they had to say was essentially correct. Tom Morey was excellent, and he should have been a writer himself.
Wow.
He would have been far more famous than even the boogie board.
Interesting. Wow. That's saying something, because it's been very famous. So let me ask you, you have a lot of different content here. I'm going to save this one for last, because this one is going to bring us to our next topic. But tell us about the kind of books that you've written. Well, let's not go into every single one of them, but
No.
you've talked about this historic character and the characters of Laguna. What else? And you've got articles that have been in surf magazines like the Surfer's Journal. What else? What are the books that you've written, and why? Or what kind of books?
I've written so many different subjects. You know, there are a few that aren't here. I did a compendium called the Whole Ocean Catalog, which was a takeoff on Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog, if you remember that.
Not well.
Not well. Well, anyhow.
But it's not all ocean-based, right?
No.
I mean, you have a much
Yeah.
wider interest than just the ocean.
King of the Sunset Strip was the story of Steve Stevens, who was a Mouseketeer and ended up as a acolyte with Mickey Cohen, the Hollywood gangster.
And this is fiction or
a-
nonfiction?
No, this is all nonfiction.
Wow.
And Steve was a classmate of mine at private school I went to in Hollywood. And he, as I said, ended up as hanging out with Mickey Cohen during that period. So having known him in high school and maintaining a friendship over the years, his was a story that I was privileged to be asked to help him write. And so I co-authored with him on that.
Oh, wow. Well, I know there's a book. I remember when you had written, it was your, what do you call it? It was your pulp fiction. It was like a,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you have it here, but,
Did I?
oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah, I think it's in
So
there.
just to show the wide swath of stuff that you've done, this is, it is what it looks like. It's a, what genre would you call this?
That's Pulp Fiction.
Pulp fiction. I think most of us just
Which
think of that as a movie.
Yeah. Pulp Fiction was a widely popular fictional style that grew out of the use of newspaper pulp in magazine production for cheap magazines. And it was a style before television and film existed on a wide scale that provided popular entertainment.
It's just so cool. It's such a creative, you have such a creative wide swath of interests and styles, and your ability to, I think you're holding one that you wrote about, is that golf?
This is about
the
golf,
other golf. Yeah.
This is the other game of golf, which is how to play the business game. And there's not a swing tip in it, not a recommendation for clubs. It's all about behavior on the course and practical principles and strategies for business on the course.
Awesome.
That was, I co-authored that with Brian Amster and Larry Salk, two wonderful golfers and terrific friends. And it was illustrated by a Laguna artist, Michael Jacques.
Got it. So there's two more that I'm going to touch on. One, we're not going to talk about it, but I just found this interesting because I wasn't aware of it. This is a book, Dave Scarman's 2017 Catalina Classic. Yeah. So Dave Scarman's another, and we'll talk about lifeguarding next. Dave's a long-term Laguna Beach lifeguard and firefighter and a unbelievable athlete, and he was my training partner in, I think, 2018. And he still paddles, and he's a monster. And I know you've been in the boat with him. And I didn't realize you'd written a book about his year, which is super fun.
Yeah.
And then the next one. So this is the one, this is going to take us to the next topic.
Okay.
So this is the most recent book, right?
Right.
Lifeguarding Laguna.
I think it is. I've gotten, well,
let's talk about Lifeguarding Laguna, because I really want to get into this. And I've been fortunate to have a number of lifeguards on this program just by chance. And so having you, so how long, when did you start lifeguarding in Laguna?
I started in Laguna in 1961 or 2.
So while
62.
Everything that we were talking about.
But I had worked for the state of California before that because Laguna didn't pay enough.
So how old were you when you first started guarding for the state? When you first started guarding, period? 18. Okay. So we were talking about when you're spending time in the garage with these guys at 14.
That's when you can be a lifeguard in California.
But so for the majority of your life, and while we were talking about all the things you were doing, you were already lifeguarding.
I requalified every year to stay in that. I was a Red Cross first aid instructor. I was did all the things you need to do to keep that job.
And did you after you did state before, and then you went on to Laguna? Did you stay at Laguna?
I worked for the state for a couple of years, and Laguna was the chief in Laguna asked me to come home and work for them. And,
how long did that last for?
I don't know, years. I became the city's first full-time.
You did?
Yeah, deputized guard.
Now, when you were, do you know roughly how long you were a Laguna guard?
Yeah, I started in 61 or 62, and until...
I thought I had read something like you had been a guard for like 50 years.
Probably... I'm trying to think, because I had a little break after I worked. After I worked as a year for the city as a full-time guard, I had a chance to become the editor of Surfing Magazine up in L.A. So I quit. Took a what's the term?
Sabbatical.
Sabbatical. And I went up there and went to work, and that's when I started really traveling a lot for Surfing Magazine. We didn't even get to that.
See, I didn't know that. Yeah. How long were you there?
I worked that was for Peterson Publication, which did Surfing Magazine, not Surfer. I worked for Surfer. My first surfing stuff was published in Surfer. That's another story I didn't give you.
So you were at surfing and surfer. You were at both.
Yeah.
At some point.
I worked. My first surfing Slick magazine article was published in Surfer magazine. John Severson rented studio space from my stepdad. They were both artists. And before he started Surfer magazine, that was what he was doing.
Wow.
He was, I think he exhibited in the Festival of Arts and had started, then he started Surfer magazine. For one of his earlier issues, I submitted a fiction story, and he published it, and boy, I was excited because I really wanted to be a fiction writer and write novels, and this was great exposure to have that single story. Suddenly I was now more than just a journalist. I was able to write fiction and get it published. And I created a character that I published in 5 or 6 different surfing magazines over the years for about 10 years or 12 years. This character would show up in stories.
That's so neat.
Short stories, 500, 600 words, 1,000, 1,500. Short stories.
But so you started with Severson at the very beginning? And then he went on to have the Western White House right there on Church, right there at Cotton's or Church, and there's some funny stories about him and the president at the time, and that's a lot of surf
plenty
history.
of good stories.
A lot of surf history.
There are a lot of good stories.
So, but let's go back to the lifeguarding.
Okay, lifeguarding.
So
how long did I guard? I'm 86 now. I think I guarded until I was in my late 70s, as long as I could qualify.
So darn close to 50, if not 50 years. I just want to give you giant kudos. I mean, that's incredible, and thank you for your service, and I'm sure you must have influenced thousands of guards, and that's...
No.
Yeah. How do you not? 100%.
No, I was just, I just put on the trunks and did the job when I...
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you praise for that regardless. 50 years of lifeguarding in Laguna must have been amazing. So tell me this, how much has Laguna changed in that time?
As they say in French, plus ça change, plus la même chose. The more it changes, the more it stays the same.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Got it.
Really. Its dominant characteristics are defined by its topography.
For sure.
And that topography so centralizes some aspects of Laguna. There are economic layers within that, as you know. But the capacity of the community to absorb and expand is limited. And so it seems to always get a little better each year. It gets a little worse.
Yeah, well, like everything and everywhere. How long have you been in your home? You're in a beautiful area of the city.
Oh, I think, when did we buy that? 80, maybe 86.
Got it. Great area.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Let me ask you this.
But I'd had a house before that.
Yeah, well, and your family goes back 100 years in
yeah.
in the city, which is amazing. Let's talk about prone paddling. We've talked about surfing and lifeguarding and writing and Tell me about prone paddling. How did that come to be a part of your world?
It's a misnomer.
Hold on. Can you explain to the audience what is prone paddling, or as you call it, what do you call it? Traditional.
Traditional.
What is it?
It's both positions, prone and kneeling. And for most of us who raced, yourself included, we were knee paddlers.
Yep.
We did the best and the fastest we did was when we were on our knees. You can get a deeper, longer reach, a better snap at the end of the stroke, and you have eyes, heads up, ability to scan the environment and see where the next little piece of breaking slop is going to push you 16 inches faster and further.
And for context, what are the boards sizes and the classes?
2 classes, unlimited and stock. 12 foot and under would be stock, and unlimited is
everything else.
No length, no design restrictions, except one hull.
And the premier race in California, historically and still, is what?
Been the Catalina race.
Catalina Classic. And what is that course?
Well, from Catalina to
Manhattan
Beach Pier.
How many times have you done that race? Do you recall?
I've paddled the course, raced it and placed twice in unlimited and in stock class. And then I paddled it for distance swimmers a bunch of
As
times.
an escort, is that right? That's incredible. I always think it's hard to paddle it, and then there's people that swim at 32 miles or the 22-mile course.
Right.
When you say placed, were you top 2 in your class?
No.
Or top 6?
They go through fifth.
It used to be 6th.
Sixth place.
Because I've only placed
I did
once, and it was
6th in unlimited and 5th in stock.
Got it.
And I
Good
was
for
the
you.
oldest guy at the time to do either of those.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah.
And that was, you were in your 50s, I think, if I recall, you did that.
Right.
That's awesome.
Well, I think late 40s, the race had not been held in years, and Buddy Bond and the LA Lifeguards put it back together, and that was
In the early 80s or so.
I think 80.
What's the
82.
what was the allure? What was the drive for you to do that channel crossing?
You know, it was back to Hobie and Tom Morey and the Laguna guard, Rennie Yater. They all designed long distance, beautiful, racing paddle boards. And that was it was still a big thing in the early 1950s with the advent of the expansion and commercialization of surfing in the 1960s, the early 1960s, the Gidget movie phenomenon. When that happened, all of that history was discarded. And everything became the nose riding right now ethos that pervaded the sport for about 5 or 6 years until it gradually then began to evolve. And it went full circle. It came back eventually to adding paddling as part of the repertoire of a rounded surfer.
Yeah, not a lot of them.
No.
No. But for those of us that have had that experience, there's nothing like it. Right?
Well, I think that became the idea of the waterman as opposed to the surfer. This was the Tom Zahn model.
These iconic, the Greg Knowles that could do it all.
Do it all.
Kind of like the guys you were talking about. They did it all when you were a kid.
Yeah.
That you did it all. That was a waterman.
It was expected if you were a surfer, you could, operate on a lot of different levels. Almost always, all of the early guys were lifeguards.
Is it safe to say that surfing was just one piece of the puzzle back then, of the waterman puzzle? Today, you can be a pure surfer, but not do anything else on the water. Where back then, you were a lifeguard, a scuba diver, a diver,
Because making a living was more difficult then. And the range of activities that would interest somebody who was already inclined in that way were so limited. So if you could add lifeguarding, I can
get paid to do this?
Yeah, I can get paid to be on the beach, and all these skills are very handy. If you can surf, you can easily learn how to make a rescue with a board.
Craig, you were making boards too under the Waterman brand and some of the premier boards for a dozen or so years.
Yes, and our pal Woody Maxwell has taken over from me. I gave him all the designs and showed him what little I knew.
Well, what's cool for me is you made me a board in 1997, and I got to go through the process with you. And then you drove me up, or we drove up together up to Santa Barbara,
That's right.
Rennie Yater's place. So and then later in life, you invited me down to it's the Surfing Heritage Museum,
right.
And I got to sit in the room with some of the icons that were surfing on the board. So you've been gracious and wonderful for me for exposing me to some of these people that I always have held in such high regard, and it's just been super cool.
It's called passing the torch. Otherwise, you get your fingers burned if you don't.
Yeah. Well, listen, and I think, and even though you poo-pooed it, I said, lifeguarding for 50 years, I promise you've left an incredible mark, and I know you have been recognized for your service to Laguna in many ways over the years through different articles that I've read and such. So I just want to say a couple things. One, thank you for all of this. Thank you for providing the history for those of us that both appreciate it and it'll live on in perpetuity. Thank you for your service as a lifeguard for 50 years. Thanks for being a super cool cat and really you've been a great friend to me, and I appreciate that we've been able to do this stuff together, and I really appreciate you being here.
Well, I'm honored to have the opportunity, and I'm glad we've known each other because it's been a fruitful friendship.
For sure.
Yeah.
Craig Lockwood.
It's been great.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. Thank you, buddy.
All right.